Morning, everybody. Welcome back. David, I'll wait for you to give me the thumbs up. All right, we've got virtual attendees online and we are recording. So let's go ahead and proceed with the next formal set of presentations. This particular session is going to be part 2 of our remediation and assessment discussion. So we've got 3 presentations here. The moderator for this morning's session is Eveland with MSc Group, who is a Montrose environmental group company. Just a couple of real quick reminders. Anybody that needs continuing education, we have affidavits of attendance out at the front desk. You're going to need to complete one of those and submit it to me. So if you don't pick one up here, I've got them on the website. You can download them and then fill it out when you get back home and send those in to us. Just as a reminder, there is a $25 charge for continuing education if you need a certificate of attendance. So with that short intro, I'm going to turn it over to Eveland and let her introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Gene. Short. So like Gene said, I'm Ellen Eveland. I actually work with Montrose Environmental Solutions. Our MSc group has since sunsetted, so legacy MSc, so we don't usually use that name anymore. Montrose Environmental Solutions, we've got a couple of booths if you guys have any questions at all. We offer a full suite of PFAS solutions from remediation and assessment, so I'm glad to be here today, to laboratory analytical, as well as treatment. I work a lot in the federal space, so I know that some of you probably sat in on the DoD. They have a lot of challenges there, spending quite a bit of money. We're participating a lot in PFAS RIs. For the Air Force is kind of ahead of the game there over the Navy and the Army. Also working with treatment, water treatment, groundwater treatment, a lot of AFFF changeouts, which is pretty big with the federal government right now. And construction-related issues has become a very big problem for them when they have new bed downs or new airstrips or whatever that they're encountering. You know, they're running into PFAS contamination all over the place and kind of trying to figure out what are they going to do with it. So I'm happy to be here today to introduce this great panel. We're going to start with Hugo Carronnier with VALGO, and he's going to give you guys some interesting information about some foam fractionation that they're working on.
Okay, that's it. Wonderful. Hi, pleased to meet you. My name is Hugo Carronnier. I'm doctor in pharmacy and toxicologist working as project manager for VALGO. Today I want to discuss with you about usual strategies to treat PFAS, but mostly about new patents about biofoam fractionation. As you heard it, I'm French, and VALGO is a French environmental remediation company. We are currently the leader in France. We are mostly present in Europe, Italy, Montenegro, Spain, but we're also present in South America and mostly in Brazil and Argentina. And we are since 2019 in Canada and I hope soon in the US. To give you a quick example of what we are doing, we are trying to be involved in every aspect of the environmental remediation. So it means we are not just doing some soil and water remediation, but we are trying to be involved since the diagnosis of the site until the valorization of it. And due to the legislation in France with the ZNA law, which means zero net artificialization of soils, we have a good experience on that. And yeah, one of our main projects was the Petroplus refinery in Rouen, in France. It was a 90-year-old refinery, heavily contaminated by hydrocarbons, heavy metals. And we bought the site in 2014. We completely dismantled it. We cleaned up the site. We removed asbestos. We recycled 75,000 tons of metals, 400,000 tons of concrete, a lot of hydrocarbons. We remediated 62 hectares of land. And so it's not looking like that yet, but it's almost ready to be constructed. So it was really a great work. And we are trying to have the same approach on PFAS. It means we are trying to be involved in every aspect of the research on PFAS, from study on PFAS toxicity with the NRA, to the global diagnosis of the site with University of Montreal, but I hope also with FIU soon, and on the treatment, of course. So usually I do some general characteristics of PFAS, but I think it's been 3 days. It's maybe too much, so I will skip this part and just pinpoint the interesting things for me. So you already know that PFAS are a large family of more than 6,000 compounds. The interesting things about these compounds that they are both hydrophilic, hydrophobic, it have a high solubility, and they are surfactants. Due to these characteristics, they are mainly used in the industry and, of course, in AFFF foams, but in a large number of goods. And that's why we have a high contamination of the environment. When you use, for example, an AFFF foam, PFAS are contaminating the soil, and through a process called lixiviation, it's contaminating the groundwater. So PFAS have a high mobility in groundwater. So we have to treat both. We have to treat soil, which acts like a reservoir, or a tank, maybe, it's a better word. And we also have to treat water, because 75% of the human exposure is linked to the consumption of contaminated water, even if there is other sources. So to treat water, we have, happily, a lot of solutions: activated carbon, ion exchange resin, filtration, also fractionation. And the usual treatment for water is 3 filters by activated carbon filters, followed by 2 IX resins. So it works well, but it's expensive. For soil, there is also a solution, but there is sustainability issues. And for degradation, there is only few solutions, and they have all pros and cons. For water, an example, activated carbon works well. We can use, it's adaptative, it has a good efficiency for long-chain PFAS. However, it can be ineffective in some situations. So just to give you a quick example, here's some results that we had in Rouen. There was contaminated water in a really high contamination in Saint-Étienne-du-Rouvray. And usual treatments by activated carbon show a limited results with 39 to 50% of removal rates, and it's not enough. But in some cases, and mainly in a place called Varas-Moulineaux, we saw that the wrong use of activated carbon was leading to an actual increase of the PFAS concentration by a factor of 3. And it was due to an error of the treatment units, because they didn't change the activated carbon on the good rhythm. So the wrong use of PFAS can be dangerous. The wrong use of activated carbon to treat PFAS can be dangerous. So it's the same thing for ion exchange resins. It has a better absorption capacity. It can achieve low treatment targets. However, it's pH sensitive, and there is a very fast saturation. And membrane solutions such as reverse osmosis are excellent, but it have a high energetic cost. And concerning water treatment, there is 2 main issues. The first one is all these methods are producing waste: activated carbon, resins, or membranes, when we have to deal with this waste. And the second issue is the cost. These methods of treatment are very expensive due to the material costs, due to the activated carbon that you have to buy regularly, due to the energetic cost. And it's the same thing for soils. For soils, there is only 2 remediation solutions. You can use landfill or stabilization, but it's not removing the contaminants. So it gives us an environmental legacy for the future generations. So we thought about thermal desorption and soil washing. Thermal desorption works well. However, in France, since the Ukrainian crisis, it can be very expensive due to the increase of the gas prices. So we did a lot of soil washing. It's only a fast transfer, yes, but it's worked well. And here's the results that we had in a former refinery in Europe. I can't tell you the name, sorry for that. But we had really interesting results on soil washing for this former refinery with a global removal rate of 97%, with a good efficiency on short-chain PFAS, of course, but also in longer PFAS and even precursors. And so this method, we are using this method to treat soils, and it's almost perfect. We are still to find a solution to deal with soil with a lot of organic matter, but it's worked well. And finally, for degradation, there is multiple solutions. There is thermal degradation, but there is an issue with that, the production of volatile PFAS, so we don't use this method. There is non-thermal plasma reactor, reduction, triple point oxidation, and all these methods are great, but in our opinion, it's very complicated to use it on field. You know, it works well on the lab, but on field it can be difficult. So that's why we try to work with oxidation without success. We saw at each time the same result for chemical and electrochemical oxidation, the same results, an increase of short-chain PFAS and a decrease of short-chain PFAS. And it's not a viable solution for us. And that's why we developed a new solution, which is called biofoam fractionation. Biofoam fractionation is very interesting. It acts in two solutions. First one, we use biofoam fractionation to reduce the volume of contaminated water. Then we degrade PFAS through another method, which is called sonolysis. The global idea of sonolysis is to use ultrasonic bubbles to degrade PFAS. It's worked well. I don't have the results yet. We had only the first result last week, but we are currently developing this method, and the first results are nice, and I hope to have the opportunity to show it to you next year. So what is the idea of biofoam fractionation? It's very simple. We want to use the properties of PFAS to treat it. You know, PFAS have an hydrophobic tail with the fluorine bonds, carbon fluorine bonds, and hydrophilic head. So PFAS are surfactants, and like soaps, they are naturally occur at the interface between air and water. So the idea is pretty simple. You get a tank, you put PFAS contaminated water inside this tank, you make small bubbles at the bottom, and you are collecting the contaminated foam. However, it's not that simple in real life. We have often to use surfactants to increase the PFAS extraction. Maybe sometimes you have to treat the surfactants afterward. We use foaming agents too. Foaming agents are costly. So we try to find a solution. When we developed and patented a solution, a biomimetic additive. So I'm very happy and excited to speak about it today, because we submitted the patent this fall, and we just had the response of the French Office of Patents yesterday, and yeah, we got it. But this additive acts in two times. First, it increases the capacity to form foam. Second, it strongly binds to PFAS, increasing the abatement rate, so replacing the surfactants. And we have a good molar ratio. One molecule of our additive is binding to 15 molecules of PFAS. And this additive is cheap, easily accessible, natural, and most important, biodegradable. Concerning the foam formation, this additive has a fast foaming capacity. We have a maximum foaming in 3 minutes, and it's a particularly dry foam that allows us to reduce the production of waste. And speaking about waste, we have approximately 1% of waste. More than that, this process is low cost, and it can process large volume as well as small volume. So we can put it into treatment units, we can put it in a wastewater treatment plant, we can put it almost everywhere, and that's why it's interesting. But I'm sure you want results more than commercial speech about it. So I will give you the last results we had on lab. So it's not the best foaming that we can do. There is other solutions to have better foamings on field. There is a lot of solutions for that, but it was water contaminated with 2,500 ng by liter of PFAS, and we treat these samples for 5 minutes. And we increase the removal rate from 4% to 99% for PFOA. From 8 to 99 for PFOS. It worked well for Genix, for FTAB, and we still have an issue with short-chain PFAS. However, you can see we can increase the result for short-chain PFAS with optimization. Sadly, I cannot tell you the secrets to optimize for short-chain PFAS because it's not patented yet. But we manage to increase the removal rate for short-chain PFAS. And I think we will reach higher concentration in the future with more optimization. So how could we use all these treatments? We can use it to treat water like this, but we also want to offer a global solution. From the soil treatments to reuse the land by soil washing, it's an optional step, but it's worked well, and we already do that in Europe. Then, by treating water directly or water contaminated during the soil the soil washing treatments, and I was telling you, we are developing sonolysis to degrade PFAS. So we want to offer a full global offer. So sonolysis is still in lab work. It's still at lab scale, but I hope to have soon the results. I think I'm on time. Thank you for your attention, and I hope it was understandable for you, because my French accent is terrible. Sorry for that.
Does anyone have any questions for Hugo? Sure.
For using the sonolysis to degrade, the PFAS in the concentrate, will the biofoam really affect the sonolytic degradation?
We did some assay, and fortunately for us, biomimetic additives are degradable through sonolysis too. So it makes sonolysis a little longer, but it doesn't affect the treatment. And it's very interesting because we had good results for PFOS and PFOA now with sonolysis, with 97 and 98% of degradation and of mineralization of PFOS and PFOA. However, we have a lot of work to do, and we will soon test for more PFAS and with really contaminated water.
Great presentation. Actually, it's a very short question. For example, I really like the idea for the foam fractionation, but adding the sonolysis part, right? In the treatment, for example, I know that it's still in the lab, and then eventually, the idea is to bring that to the facilities, right? Wouldn't that also increase a lot the cost in terms of energy, or do you guys have in France some already with sonolysis, some plants already with that?
So we are still doing the maths just to know what is the cost. For sonolysis, I think it's something like 1 euro cents. I don't know, it's the same thing in dollar, but 1 cent 10 cents, 10 cents by cubic meter. So it's not that expensive. And for foam fractionation, we are still doing the calculus because we have to know what kind of foam fractionator should we use.
Hey, great presentation. I had a question about, is that going to be mostly used as a pre-treatment step prior to carbon polishing to get down to, let's say, 4 parts per trillion for PFAS? Or?
By our first results, we don't need polishing treatment after. However, we need some sun filtration before the treatment, and to remove all the, the big co-contaminants we can have. If we have a lot of hydrocarbons, it's better to remove a part of these hydrocarbons first. But we don't need post-treatment. Yes.
Hi. I don't know if you heard about the surface activation foam fractionation, the SAF.
Yes.
Okay, so my question is, can your product be used on other foam fractionations, or is it specific to your unit?
We don't have unit yet. However, we are working with several people doing foam fractionation to adapt our treatments to foam fractionator. But also to have, we also, sorry for that, it's hard for me to say it, and I'm struggling to find my words. We are working with them to adapt our treatment to their treatment units, but we are also trying to find a solution to add this treatment in wastewater treatment plants, so with high volumes, to assess multiple markets.
Questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugo, and congratulations on your patent. That's very exciting. And it was started with his thesis, apparently, so that's a long road coming, so it's awesome. Our next speaker is Jenny Olmsted. She's with CDM Smith, and she's going to be talking about the impacts of different land use types. I guess you're using stormwater pond sediments. Yeah. Great.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Jenny Olmsted, and I work for CDM Smith out of Atlanta as an environmental engineer. And today I am going to present on my master's project research titled Using Regulatory Classifications to Assess the Impact of Different Land Use Types on Per and PolyFluoroAlkyl Substance Concentrations in Stormwater Pond Sediments. And I just want to give a special thanks to everybody on this slide because they really worked with me through the COVID-19 pandemic and to follow CDC guidelines to make sure I graduated on time and I could start working. All right, so the objectives of this study were to determine sediment PFAS concentrations in Florida stormwater ponds located in different land uses. And then also to assess two different regulatory classifications, systems to predict and screen PFAS at stormwater ponds. And caused by the transient nature of most water in stormwater ponds, that's the reason why I decided to take sediments, just to have a more robust historical blueprint of PFAS at these stormwater ponds. And so this is a brief outline for my presentation today. We'll get into some background, methods, results, and then we'll wrap up with conclusion with hopefully some time for some questions at the end. So let's get right into the background. So what are stormwater ponds and how can we use the Landscape Development Intensity Index and the roadway classification to help screen stormwater ponds? Well, stormwater ponds are used as best management practice for the treatment of stormwater. So you can imagine during dry days, pollution and contaminants build up on impervious surfaces. This is your paved streets, your shopping plazas, and then once a rain event occurs, all these contaminants get washed away and most usually end up in stormwater ponds. So stormwater ponds can be regulated under multiple water pollution control programs, where most public-owned water systems are regulated at the state level, while state agencies get the NPDES permit from the EPA through the Clean Water Act. And then caused by the molecular structure of PFAS, as my colleagues have mentioned, with a hydrophilic head and a hydrophobic tail, we believe once PFAS are released into the environment, water is the primary mechanism of their transport. All right, now the Landscape Development Intensity Index. This was developed by Mark T. Brown at the University of Florida in 2004 and has been adopted by the FDEP to help discern how land disturbance affects coastal waterways, wetlands, streams, etc. So the FDEP has a wonderful open data geospatial online, and they recently published an entire LDI layer for the state of Florida. And so this assigns an LDI to the entire state of Florida. And so as you can see, I clicked in the land use around this hotel, and it showed an LDI of 8. And so if you can go over to this table, you can see an LDI of 8 is low intensity commercial, which kind of makes sense for this land use, where open water and pastures has a land use about 1 and 2, and then industrial has probably a land use most like around 9 or 10. And so then this is the second standardized classification system I use to weigh my PFAS data against. And the Department of Transportation classifies roads by their road function for data and planning purposes. And so this is how I was able to assign the designation of urban or rural to my stormwater ponds. And then just to take a brief moment to differentiate what defines an urban road over a rural road is urban roads usually carry almost all urban travel on the least amount of mileage, and they also serve major activity centers. And now rural roads, they provide just a connected network with no dead ends, and they usually have long distance travel similar to interstate travel. Okay, so now that we have a little bit of background of how we can use these classification systems against our PFAS data, let's get right into how I collected this data. So this is my study area, which is north central Florida. I selected 9 stormwater pond sites. So site 7 is to the west of Jacksonville. Site 1 and site 6 is where Gainesville, Florida, Go Gators, is located. And then site 9, Orlando, is to the south of site 9 and site 8. Okay, so now this is a zoomed up version of my 4 rural stormwater ponds on Google Earth, and you can see the land use around them. They're pretty much surrounded by forest on 3 sides and a road on 1 side. As well as I decided to sample 2 locations in my stormwater ponds to discern if there's a variability in PFAS concentrations across the stormwater pond. So location 1 was where a stormwater inlet was located, or where I saw water moving the most, and then location 2 was on the adjacent side, or where it was safe, because I did encounter alligators on this sampling adventure, because we're in Florida, right? Okay, so now this is a zoomed in version of my urban stormwater ponds, and you can see the land use has changed dramatically. So site 6, site 7, site 8, there's a commercial shopping plaza around them. Site 1 is surrounded by a residential neighborhood, and site 9 has an industrial facility across the way from it. Now, sample collection. So at each of my stormwater ponds, at each location, I decided to take a composite sample, which is 3 subsamples along a 1 meter transect. And of course, I decided a composite sample over a graph sample just because it's more representative of that stormwater pond. And like we mentioned yesterday, to get to these PPT and PPQ levels, it all comes down to the sampling and how good of sampling you are to reduce false negatives and false positives. So some special considerations I made while sampling were to, of course, take a field blank into the field and expose it to the environment while I sampled. I changed my nitrile powderless free nitrile gloves, changed immediately before sample collection. I placed my labels on my bottles after I collected the sample because, hey, there might be PFAS in the labels. And then I also minimized the time sample bottle was open, so I made sure my labels were filled out, my stainless steel trowel was ready to go. I could go to my sample location, quickly collect my sample, and close that bottle immediately. And then that bottle stays closed until it's extraction time in the analytical laboratory. And then more recently, over the past few years, more research is published that not necessarily equipment and materials that are in the general area where I'm sampling actually contribute to PFAS cross-contamination. So now we're taking more of like a tiered approach, where if there is materials or equipment in direct contact with the sample, then we need to verify that that is PFAS free. And then if we can't verify that, then we need to take an equipment blank for that material or equipment. And then if there is materials and equipment in the general area while you sample, you just want to do best effort to minimize those materials. So the analytical analysis, the extraction was done in Dr. Townsend's Sustainable Material Management Lab on the University of Florida campus, and then the actual analysis occurred in Dr. Bowden's lab using the HPLC MSMS. And so we used a similar isotope dilution method to EPA draft method 1633. And then at the time of this study, of course, the total oxidizable precursor assay and total organic fluorine were still in development. And if I had those tests available to me at the time, I most likely would have elected to do them, just because at my urban ponds, there may be a higher amount of precursors or other PFAS substances that would not be in my targeted analysis. And so that's why I put our cute little iceberg on there, because targeted analyses are only the tip of the iceberg. And really to characterize sites, total oxidizable precursor assay is really important. And again, as people previously mentioned, organic matter can drive adsorption into sediments through aggregate formation. So again, I wanted to test the percent organic matter to make sure there wasn't any variability across my stormwater ponds. And again, pH, because we know pH drives speciation of chemicals. Okay, so now how did I determine the LDI index and roadway functional classification? So as I previously mentioned, the FDEP made a new LDI index layer, and so I uploaded that layer into my own ArcGIS Pro project, and then I took concentric circles from the center of my stormwater pond going outwards, and then I took an area weighted mean of the LDI within those different circles. And so you can see for the 400 meter LDI, it has about a 4.61, and a 1200 meter LDI about 3.14. And so that's how I was able to get one quantitative number to assess the land use in that particular area. And then for the roadway functional classification, I just looked up the road next to that stormwater pond, and I looked up the roadway classification for that road. All right, so now before we get into the results, I just want to take a moment to talk about the nuances of PFAS data, especially with the number of analytes and the required PPT and PPQ levels. So specifically for this study, I learned how you manage your limit of detection and limit of quantitation must stay consistent, and you must define that if you do statistics such as mean and total PFAS. And so for this study, I assigned my LOD and LOQ a designation of 0, and of course that will bias my results low. And working in such low detection limits, these biases are more apparent, so you definitely want to be aware of that. So working through processing this data, I learned that median range may be a better to report than mean or total PFAS, because median range, you don't necessarily need to define how you handle your limit of detection and limit quantitation, whereas total PFAS and mean you do. And then I just want to take a moment for your eyes to look at this table. So this is my limit of detection and limit of quantitation I had for this study. And of course, HFPODA, aka Gen X, I had really high limit of detection, limit of quantitation. And so I reported at all my stormwater ponds that Gen X was not present there. However, my limited detections were so high, Gen X most likely could be there. And yes, we care about false positives, but we as an environmental community care more about false negatives, because you could not be reporting a chemical when it's actually there. And then that could be in concentrations that are at risk to a human or environmental receptor. So once you get your electronic data deliverable from the lab, it's really important to check that the lab received the limit of detection, limit of quantitation that your project needs to make sure you don't report false negatives. Okay, so let's get right into the results. So out of the 51 targeted PFAS I looked for, I quantified 28 of them in my stormwater ponds. And so this is a bar graph of the frequency of the 28 PFAS that I found at my stormwater ponds. And I just want to give a special note to precursors, especially 6,2-dipap. 6,2-dipap was the only precursor, the only PFAS found at all my stormwater ponds. And this is interesting because we're looking at wastewater effluent, and 6,2-dipap is one of the primary PFAS we find in wastewater effluent as well. And one of Dr. Townsend's PhD student just published a great paper linking 6,2-dipap to toilet paper. So I thought that was interesting that 6,2-dipap was found at all my stormwater ponds, and 6,2-dipap is a really prominent contaminant in wastewater effluent. As well as you can see that there is more perfluorocarboxylic acids over PFSAs, and this may allude to, hey, there might be precursor degradation. We know precursors degrade into PFCAs, so that might be why we see more PFCAs. And generally, long-chain PFAS concentrations were generally higher than short-chain PFAS concentrations at all my stormwater pond sites. And this matches the literature and makes sense, right? Because long-chain PFAS are easier absorbed to solid surfaces, and then there's competitive absorption with short-chain compounds. And so that's why, and when you're looking in solids, you usually see longer chain compounds. And then again, I just want to take a note that I didn't have any special acidic or basic conditions in my stormwater ponds to rule out a stormwater pond. And again, with my organic matter, it wasn't extremely high to where like I saw a pattern of, oh, I have high organic matter at this site, I have high PFAS. That wasn't the case in this study. Okay, so now this is just a handful of my results for urban and rural stormwater ponds for PFOA and PFOS between locations, and the big takeaway from this slide is I did not find significant differences in sediment concentrations between my locations. So if you go out to a stormwater pond, it's safe to assume that no matter where you sample in that stormwater pond, it's most likely consistent throughout that pond. And as you can also see, PFOS was found in greater concentrations than PFOA. Now the LDI index results. So the LDI did not significantly correlate to PFAS contamination, either by total PFAS, individual, or frequency. However, when I plotted the LDI index with my total PFAS, and I got best fit line for my 0.4 kilometer radius out of my stormwater ponds, I got an R-squared about 0.71. And so that's not where we want it to be to say we have a strong correlation, but there may be some association there that could further, with further research we could nail in on. And then also I just want to state the two sites with the lowest PFAS burden had the lowest LDI. And then the site with the highest PFAS burden by far had the highest LDI. Okay, so now this is the roadway functional classification results. This table shows the range of my maximum PFAS concentrations, median, and number of sites each PFAS was detected at. And I just want to note that all the PFAS mentioned in the proposed EPA MCLs were found at all my sites except Gen X, because we talked about that, regardless of land use. But if you can see, just for zooming in, like PFOA at rural sites was below limit of quantitation to about 0.60614 nanograms per gram, and it was found at 3 of 4 rural ponds, where in my urban stormwater ponds, PFOA ranged from 0.016 to 0.227 nanograms per gram, and it was found at all 5 of my urban stormwater pond sites. So you can see there is an increase in PFAS concentrations at urban sites, as well as, unfortunately, PFOS was above all the EPA RSLs at all of my sites. So this is why usually stormwater ponds are fenced. You do not want to take a picnic by them. You don't want to set up your chair and just look at the water. These ponds are dangerous and you should not play in them. All right, so this is the most exciting part of my study, is I found significant differences in my roadway classification results. And of course, we know environmental data is never normally distributed because the earth is messy. I used the Mann-Whitney-Wilcoxon test to determine the significant differences. And PFHXA concentrations were greater at urban stormwater pipes than rural stormwater ponds. So that's pretty interesting, right? Well, like PFHXA is found in surface coatings and paints. So this makes sense in urbanized environments. There's greater paints and surface coatings that over time PFHXA can build up. As well as I found a significant difference in the number of PFAS between my rural and urban sites, where the number of PFAS was greater, of course, at my urban sites. And then you may be asking, well, how is this PFAS getting in these stormwater ponds? Well, we believe that it can come from pesticides, biocides, cement, road dust, biosolids, paint, building materials, yeah. And so now I'm going to get into conclusions and we can wrap up with a few questions. All right, so PFAS was unfortunately detected at all of 9 of my stormwater ponds, regardless of land use. LDI index may not solely explain presence of PFAS, except in extreme cases. So this might be good for someone if they are only concerned in the stormwater ponds that might have the greatest PFAS burden. It might be worthwhile to get an ArcGIS Pro, get your LDI, and assess your different LDIs for your different ponds. But the roadway functional classification was a more reliable tool to screen PFAS at stormwater ponds. And then again, since we found significant differences in PFHXA concentrations, we believe land use disturbance indicators may be more predictive for some PFAS than others. For example, PFAS that are in surface coatings, paints, construction materials, land disturbance indicators may be more useful for those than others. So that is my presentation today. I want to thank you for your time, and I open the floor to questions.
So one of my questions is that many of these stormwater ponds, we don't know the age of them, and would the age of the pond potentially also affect the PFAS concentrations, or would we also expect stratification within the sediments, especially in an old pond, if it hasn't been cleaned out frequently?
Yes, that's a great question. So of course there is many different processes happening at these stormwater ponds. The age, different metals, different absorption rates, different flows, different land uses. This study was just supposed to set a way to roughly screen stormwater ponds, and so the age of the stormwater pond may be a factor, these other items may be a factor, but at the end of the day, we have a problem and we need to determine where the greatest PFAS burden is, and no matter the age or whatever the stormwater pond is, we care about where PFAS burden is the greatest. So yes, if a stormwater pond is older than a newer stormwater pond, it could have less PFAS, but it also defines on the land use around it that might affect it more, if that makes sense.
Do you guys have any surface water data, the pond water data, also nearby natural soil background data?
Could you repeat your question?
The stormwater pond water
Yes.
sample or nearby natural soil background soil sample result?
I did
Or
not.
just the pond sediment samples?
Yes, so I just looked at the pond sediments and not the surface water because of transient nature of surface water. And I went out just one sampling event, and we know, hey, there might be a weird occurrence where a rain event, there's one spill, and you could capture that. Whereas sediments, I feel like it was a more stable parameter over time to test rather than just the transient nature of water, especially since I only went out there one time to sample. If it was more of like a year program, then most likely I could have done surface water, but I felt like this was the best to apply my land disturbance indicators to.
Only one trip, this is tremendous work.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, especially in the COVID-19 pandemic. It was hard. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. That was a great study, and I appreciate your energy. It's great. Our next presenter is John LaChance with TerraTherm, and he's going to discuss thermal remediation of PFAS.
All right. Thank you very much. And that is a tough act to follow, so I'll try to do my best. I could use a couple cups of coffee, though, I think would help. Yeah, and actually great presentations, both of you. So anyways, what I want to talk today about is some work we've been doing to look at the potential for using thermal remediation to address PFAS. And I work for TerraTherm. I'm VP of development there. And TerraTherm is a company that focuses on thermal remediations. Most of our sites are 100 degrees C. We're targeting CVOCs, other VOCs, type compounds. But we have, and we do work on high temperature. We call high temperature something greater than 100 C where we heat soil either in situ or in piles to temperatures 250 C, 350, even 450 C. So that's what we were curious about, is can we address this difficult problem of PFAS using these high temperature approaches. First off, I'd like to acknowledge the folks who actually did all the work, who did the heavy lifting on this. My colleagues at TerraTherm, Allison Fortune, Stefan Gripke, Aaron Hauber, and Greg McLeod, and our partners in Denmark who actually hosted and did the work for us. They had the laboratory space and the equipment, so that's Soren Eriksson and Xiao Xiao. And then Lynn Katz from the University of Texas at Austin. There we go. So we started this work about 4 years ago, and the question was, as I said before, can thermal remediation be effective at PFAS, and to what degree? Basically, thermal remediation works by a couple of mechanisms, especially at high temp. What we're trying to do is degrade the compounds, so destroy them in some instances, and we've done this with PCBs, dioxins, PAHs. Also, by getting to these temperatures, we increase the volatility. So they're still semi-volatile. They're not quite volatile compounds in the sense of their vapor pressures, but they do. There is an appreciable volatilization that occurs at these elevated temperatures. So we're trying to look to see what kind of removal we could get for PFAS from soil. So we looked at soil from 4 different sites, and I'll show you some of the pre-data in a minute here. And we basically heated those samples up to 250, 350, and as much as 500 C. And we held those temperatures for 7 days for each sample. And then we looked at the soil, the condensate, and the sorbent tubes to try to assess where the PFAS removal occurred, as well as try to close the mass balance. And you'll see that was didn't quite work out the way we planned. So this gives you site 1 and 2 soils. You can see the list of focus list of compounds here. We actually analyzed for about 30 PFAS. These are the ones that were detected across all 4 sites. Site 1 had very high concentrations. I think we had starting concentrations of 100 milligrams per kilogram of PFOS. And you can see that at 250 C, we don't really see much happening. And that actually kind of makes sense given what we know about the stability of these compounds, their volatility. However, when we get to 350 C, we see the target compounds, I'm just going to use this term, disappear from the soil, because there's a question that we're going to ask and answer later about what happens when you see this target list of compounds go away. What does that mean? And when we heat it to 500 C, you can actually see we got some additional destruction. When we ran site in 3 and 4, the starting concentrations were a little bit lower, and we worked with the lab to improve the method detection limits. Again, this was like 4 years ago, so we're kind of, at the starting gate of how to do some of these analytical methods and get the detection limits down. But we were able to get our detection limits down. What we were seeing here, especially in that site 1 soil, is we heat to 350 C, we're getting roughly 99.99% removal of the target list of PFAS. So that's all good. We were excited about that. We also had this question of, okay, so we're getting this removal. Is it mineralization? Are we getting degradation, and are the precursor compounds remaining in the soil? Or are we getting degradation and volatilization of those compounds, or straight up volatilization of the PFAS out of the soil? So we did selective reactive ion mass spec on the vapors, and interestingly, we found a lot of decomposition products and fragments, including PFCAs and precursor compounds coming out. So we kind of have a glimpse of what's happening here. We're definitely getting some degradation and some volatilization occurring. So just to wrap this up, because we're going to talk about phase 2, which is really what I'm most excited about as the second set of work that we did here, is that we were able to get PFAS eliminated from the soil by heating 350 to 500 C. Obviously, 500 C requires more energy and more time, so it's less sustainable, more intensive, and more costly. So if we can get treatment and optimized treatment at 350 C, that's kind of ideal. The fluorine is removed, corresponding to PFAS removed from the soil, so that was important. So again, we know we're not just changing it into something that's staying in the soil, it's actually being removed from the soil. The mechanism is both volatilization and degradation, followed by volatilization of the degradation products. However, we couldn't close the mass balance given our setup and what we were sampling and how we were sampling. We looked at target PFAS, we did TOPA analysis to back out what our precursor concentrations were before and after, and we also looked at total inorganic fluorine, so HF that might be formed indicating mineralization of the PFAS. But adding all that up, we couldn't get to our starting mass of fluorine, so we're scratching our heads a bit. So again, what is the remaining questions here that led us to our second phase of work was, what are these mechanisms? We can get the target list to go away. If a client comes to us and says, we have this target list, 4, 5, 6 compounds or 30 compounds, can you treat it? Well, what is the definition of treatment? If it's just getting that target list to go down to some low value, we can do that. But from a permitting perspective and from a performance and future liability, we need to understand what's left in the soil, what the fate of that PFAS is. Does it come out? Does it go into the vapor stream? And how do we assess that? You can imagine that, it's great to say that, well, we get rid of this target list, but we're also creating this vapor stream. How do we treat that? And how do we monitor that and prove that we're not emitting something that's got some future potential liability associated with it? So phase 2, this brings us to phase 2 of the project, which we just completed about a year ago. And this involved taking clean sand. I'll say clean sand because we also detected PFAS in our clean sand and unidentified fluorine compounds and all of that, so that's always exciting. And we spiked it with PFAS. So we bought lab-grade PFAS, we mixed it in with water, created a slurry in our sand, and you can see we put it into this container right here. This is our PFAS soil chamber. You also see a second chamber in here. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. That second chamber is what we call the defluorinator media. So we're also looking at how do we, this off-gas stream that comes out that may have unknown compounds, unknown PFAS products in it, how do we scrub that a little bit better so we decrease the loading onto our off-gas treatment system and improve its efficiency? So we had you'll see here in a second, we had a 2-stage kind of setup. The first part of that is the soil chamber like we had previously. We were heating to 350C, and then we also had the defluorinated media. So what we were doing, the intent here is that after we boiled off the water, so you got to think about this, you're heating the soil up, it's got water present, it's going to sit there at 100 degrees C. It's going to buffer until you basically add enough heat to boil that water off. Once it's dry, then you can get to the higher temperatures we wanted. So during this phase, the off-gas bypassed the defluorinator, went into a condensate collection system, and then what we added in here to trap the HF, indicating mineralization of the PFAS, was a alkaline impinger. The defluorinator we brought online once the soil sample dried out and we got to temperatures above 100 degrees C, indicating water's gone, so we bypassed the condensate impinger and everything went through the defluorinator and then onto the alkaline impinger. Now, the defluorinator is basically a media that's structured. I can't really say a whole lot about it. We have a pending patent, so I'm in competition with Hugo here. We're in a race to get our patents. But basically, this media, we heat to 600 C to get additional degradation of the PFAS compounds. So this is basically our setup. Boil it, condensate collection, and then once it's dry or high temperature and dry, then we go through the defluorinator and through the alkaline impinger, and then we have a vapor sorbent tube at the back end. So we analyzed for at the time, a pretty comprehensive list of PFAS. I think there's 36 of them here. We were evaluating a bunch of different media and mixtures of media for a defluorinator, as well as, so we analyzed all of those samples after we ran the soil test. So we repeated the soil test 4 times. So we had our spiked soil, and we'd run it through different media for 4 different runs. We also tested the clean sand that was the base media for the defluorinator compound and for the mixture that we put in the soil chamber. We initially were looking for target PFAS and extractable fluoride, again looking for mineralization and trying to close the mass balance using those analyses. what we found is that we needed some additional analyses to figure out where the fluorine went. So I'll talk about that here in a minute. So similar to the first phase, we got very high removal efficiency for those target compounds. For the 4 different runs we did, we saw an average of 99.5% removal. And when we put that in perspective, what we're seeing from the US EPA in terms of regional screening levels, we were below those residential soil cleanup or screening level numbers. We don't really have cleanup numbers. That's one of the things that we're waiting on. What are the cleanup numbers? What are the emission numbers? What are the discharge standards that we have to design and treat to? But when we look at the residential cleanup numbers, I think we had about 50 ppb in the average for the 4 runs, and the residential soil cleanup numbers about 130, so we're well below that. We were not, however, below the risk-based protection of groundwater number. That's very low. That's 38 ppt, and it may even be below. This was about a year and a half ago. May even still be below detection limits for soil matrices. Again, we can get to those numbers potentially by going to higher temperatures, but one of the things we're also looking at is maybe there's a better way of not just looking at soil numbers, but looking at our treated soil and doing leachate tests on that to see what actually comes out and how that compares with the groundwater protection number. So let's move on to the results. One of the things we did that Lynn Katz did in her group at University of Texas is to do some X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy for us on these samples. And what we're looking at here is this really looks at the surface. We're wondering what happens with this fluorine that's associated with a PFAS mass. What's interesting about this is that the first sample here is our control. So this is basically clean sand. These are the samples that were spiked with PFAS. And we actually do see a little bit of fluorine in our starting clean sand. But when we look at the spike samples post-treatment, after we're done, we see these strong signals for formation of metal fluorides. Now, we really don't know what those metal fluorides are. We have a limited volume of soil that we're treating and that we can analyze. So if we had more soil, we could do more detailed analysis of that. But the cool thing is that we're actually seeing some mineralization and binding of that fluorine on these metal fluorides in the soil. So that gives us some ideas of where this fluorine goes. Yeah, and I already mentioned this. We also saw good reproducibility with our duplicate samples. So here's the holy grail, right? You know, everybody talks about, okay, you're doing this. Does it just disappear? Do you know where it goes? What is the fate of this? And we took a close look at whether we could close the mass balance. The challenge was here, if we just looked at the target PFAS, the precursors, calculated precursors that we had based on the TOPA analyses, and the mineralized or extractable fluoride, we couldn't close the mass balance. We couldn't figure out what happened to the fluorine mass or find the fluorine mass that started here by assessing what we could measure with these analyses in the defluorinated media, the condensate or the alkaline impinger or the soil vapor. It didn't add up to 100%. I think it added up to something like 20 or 30%. So we were missing a fair chunk of the fluorine. So again, working with our team and talking to some folks, we decided to try something called combustion ion chromatography, or CIC. Now, this is normally done on extractable extractant from the sample. We didn't do the extractant. We basically just analyzed the entire sample. So that gave us a total picture of organic fluorine in that sample. And what we found is that the majority of the fluorine in the treated soil and in the spent defluorinator media was associated with organic fluorine that we picked up on the CIC analysis. Oh, let me go back here, if I can. There we go. Yeah, and you can see when we look at what we can find in terms of target PFAS, of course these are very low, right? We removed all the target PFAS. We expected to see some fluorine or fluoride associated with mineralization. We did in the soil, but not so much in the target media. But when we did the CIC analysis, we found basically 80% 98% of the fluorine total fluorine that was present in those different media or in those samples was associated, that turned up on the CIC analysis was this organic fluorine that came out or that was present there. So when we look at this total system fluorine mass balance, we know what we started with in the soil. We can calculate what we spiked in here, our volumes, and what we see is that when we, based on the CIC analysis, based on the target list, based on the precursor analysis, we get this kind of spread or division of the fluorine mass. 42% remained in the soil, and this was these metal fluorides, potentially organometal fluorides. We're not really sure what that is. Remember, that's about, I forget, 80% or so of these unknown compounds, fluorine compounds that are sorbed or bound to the soil surface. What's interesting is that we saw 48% of that starting fluorine mass move over to the defluorinator media. That basically indicates volatilization of the PFAS and degradation and volatilization of those byproducts. So that's what we suspected, but we got confirmation of that. The rest of the PFAS mass, very little shows up in the condensate. We do see HF that gets knocked out in the alkaline impinger. And think of this as a scrubber that you might have on an oxidizer. This is basically an alkaline caustic scrubber at the back end. And then in the sorbent tube, the good news here is that we see very little of the fluorine, very little PFAS, target PFAS, it's barely above the detection limit in the sorbent tube. So the takeaway here is that this system is very effective at getting the PFAS, target PFAS, out of the soil. And the defluorinator media is very effective at scrubbing it and keeping it from, reducing the loading on your off-gas treatment system. And that the alkaline impinger can remove that HF. And then what we actually see going out of a system like this is very little fluorine associated with the PFAS. So let's get an overall summary of where we are today. So the majority of the fluorine mass is captured in the treated soil and the media. So we know where that is. We're just not quite sure what it is. It looks like it's organometal or metal fluorides bound to the surface, and that's going to drive some of our future work is to figure out what that is. We did see mass transfer, so this volatilization mechanism from the soil to the media. And the use of the media and the alkaline impinger was very effective at eliminating any kind of fluorine associated with the PFAS being discharged to the atmosphere. So where we're looking to go here is to do some more fun and have some more fun in the lab. There's something called time of flight mass spec that we would like to engage and use as we heat up the soil, see what's actually coming out of the soil, see if we can identify these compounds that are being volatilized. And then once we know what those compounds are, we can take something like a Fourier transform infrared spectrometer and calibrate that for those compounds, so then we can get a real-time measurement or assessment. We can use that instrument to basically sample real-time what's coming out of a pile or an in situ application and see when that fluorine mass shows up, when it comes out. And that's important for us to know when to stop treatment, because then we can reduce the amount of time and amount of energy. So we can track that peak as it comes out of fluorine, indicating degradation and removal of that mass, and then we can shut the system off when it decreases. We also want to do, obviously, some more work to see just what this organofluorine or metal fluorides are that are remaining on the media, because that has a big impact on its potential mobility. Is it soluble? Is it bound? Will it stay bound for a while, et cetera? There's a number of questions there. And this leachability question, all right? So does the treated soil or the media leach any sort of fluorine-associated PFAS? And then, as I mentioned before, we want to kind of we do want to get a better idea of the mineralization versus vaporization versus inorganic forms. And we'd like to go bigger. So we do have some proposals. We have a couple opportunities where we're looking at a larger box, a couple 2 to 3 cubic yard box or cubic meter box. and some field scale application opportunities. So what would this actually look like from a full scale? On the top, you see a pile configuration. This would be in situ. This would have to be above the water table because any water that continues to come in would prevent us from getting to the temperatures required, to temperatures above 100 degrees C. We would extract those vapors, send them through a condenser. This is our condensate knockout. That would all have to go to a liquid treatment system, but again, we're seeing very little of the PFAS mass show up in that liquid treatment, so using something like foam fractionation to concentrate it might be the way to go. And then we would send it through something like our configuration for a DF media type system where we could get further destruction of precursors or PFAS-related compounds. And then we'd have our acid gas scrubber, our alkaline impinger, and then through discharge to the atmosphere. So is this pie in the sky? Well, this is a project we did in Vietnam a number of years ago that was focused on dioxins that were associated with disposal of Agent Orange around a former military airbase. In total, we treated about 120,000 cubic yards of impacted sediments. We did that in 2 phases. Each phase was about 60,000 cubic yards. And you can see the pile here. This is roughly 20 feet high, about the size of a football field. And we heated that to temperatures of about 450 C. The results were really good. We had very stringent cleanup levels for dioxins, 2378 TCDD. We had average concentrations in the soil for both phases less than 0.2 PPT. And this actually is a picture of the top of the pile, which is very cool. Anyways, with that, I'm going to finish up and allow time for any questions. No questions? Yeah. Somebody have a microphone?
Yeah, I got one. Hang on
Natalie
one
has a
sec.
question in the front. Oh, okay.
There's someone in the back.
One sec, sorry, there's someone in the back.
Hey, John, great presentation. I saw in your bench that you were using temperatures of 350 to 500 C.
Yep.
And I've seen other bench studies where it took 900 to 1,000 C. Is that because you're heating it for a longer period of time that you're getting the 99.99 destruction versus the higher temps at a shorter period of time?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. On paper, it looks like it should be you need to get to higher temperatures, right, for destruction of the PFAS. Sabron has a smoldering technology where maybe that's what you're familiar with, where they will take a soil sample or sand that's impacted or soil that's impacted with PFAS, mix it with GAC, and then basically it's your barbecue, right? It's barbecue in a box, and you burning the fuel sources, the GAC, and that will get you to temperatures of 900, 1,000, 1,200, and that's very effective at getting rid of the PFAS. So we knew that was out there and that would work. And we approached it from our experience working with other recalcitrant compounds like dioxins and PCBs, where on paper you should need to get to these higher temperatures, but we see very good removal efficiency at 350, 400, in that range, 350 to 500. It is a time at temperature kind of process. So if you hold it for 1 day at 350, or 7 days at 350, it's better than 1 day at 500. I'll just put it that way. And we could treat it to 1,000, but that's much more expensive and much more intensive in terms of a design and operation. So I do think the removal mechanisms that we're seeing are volatilization, partially at the 350C, 400C, as well as breakdown and degradation. I think there's complex degradation mechanisms occurring that aren't not just straight up, breakdown at thermal at these elevated temperatures. I think there's also catalytic or facilitated degradation mechanisms in the soil, and mineral surfaces. Yep.
I mean, great presentation, John. Really enjoyed it. It was actually it's not really a question. It's just actually a suggestion. I saw that you mentioned it, like, for example, for trying to understand what are these degradation products being formed. And I think like people already mentioned in the, yesterday, like to use a non-target approach, and you might be able to kind of figure out what are the different species that might be formed. And then in your case, like since it's like mostly volatile, I would go like for a QTOF, not a TOF, a QTOF, so a high resolution mass spec.
We're going to have a chat after this.
Okay, yeah, you should go to that and use a GC QTOF or, you know, orbit trap at a high resolution mass spec.
It's really interesting. The time period between the first phase and the second phase, the sampling and analytical methods change dramatically, and our ability to look at these things, it's changing like every week. You know, we have a couple pending opportunities that we're excited about, revving the team back up and getting back in there, and yeah, we're excited about some of these new methods, so we'll seek you out.
A couple of questions. I see 3 hands go up. Okay, hang on.
How we do?
Just a quick question. If I understand your process right, it works pretty well on soil. What would you do for the groundwater?
Well, we wouldn't do groundwater. So, that's a really good question. We typically will focus on source zones, right? So traditionally that would be DNAPL source zone, PCE, TCE, et cetera. And there's soil and groundwater associated with that, but we're really looking at the high mass. This approach is really PFAS source zone treatment. Groundwater would need to be addressed in some other fashion, you know, sorptive wall or, you know, some way of eliminating that. But the idea is to get the source out so we don't have continued leaching to the groundwater. Yeah.
Sure.
Good question.
Thank you. Based on your other projects, and going from sand, the pilot study, to full scale with soils that have organic matter and clay minerals in them, how good a predictor is that for real life situations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, there's a trade-off, right? Sand is sand. We know what it is, and clean sand is kind of clean sand. You know, it makes it a lot easier. The first study, the phase 1 study, was actually done on site soils. So those were not spiked, those are real soil samples, including all the complexities of a range of soil particles, range of mineralogies, as well as organic carbon. And you know, those results are really good. We think we can get the same kind of results, you know, we're sure we can get the same kind of results with real world soil. It's just more complex when we're trying to figure out these mechanisms and what's happening, so that's why in the second phase, we looked at spiking clean sand with PFAS, or just one compound. So we could try to simplify the mechanisms and analytical methods so we could understand the mechanisms better. Yep.
Yeah, so do you think TOF is going to give you the mass range that you need, or would you expect, because I think you want to run it as a continuous process and analytical, watching the continuous effluent off of this? And so would you consider like using quadrupoles? And how would you couple the FTIR to that? And would you think about using like high resolution NMR instead?
Yeah, all good questions. So Allison Fortune is our chemist. And she drove the work. You can see this kind of study is, any kind of study with PFAS is heavily analytical. So I'm not a chemist. I only play one on TV sometimes, poorly. So those are good questions. But what we're really trying to do with the real-time monitoring is to have, well, what we don't want to do is OTM 45, right? So we're looking at ways that we can, in these pilot studies, in these bench scale studies, to identify the mechanisms and nail that down, understand what's left in the soil and in the media, the defluorinator media, as well as what's coming in the off gas, right? So we're pretty intensive right now, just trying to focus and quantify that. The FTIR is one idea. There's a lot of other things that we could potentially use. There's something called a sniffer out there, which I forget what that stands for, but it's kind of like it's a time of flight instrument. I forget if it's MS or what. But the issues with what we're doing, we're heating this vapor stream to 350 C, right? So it's coming out pretty hot. We have to condition it before it goes to some of these instruments. So we're looking at instruments that we can condition and not lose mass in that conditioning step, or be able to quantify it, but get a real-time signal so that we can identify track better what's going out on these pilot scales. On full scale, it may be something like quadrupole or something else, or FTIR that we can use to monitor that. But what we're really trying to do is close down, the understanding of the mechanisms and what's coming out when, so that we can design a full-scale project, incorporate some of that into that full-scale project, so we don't have to have too intensive of a off-gas treatment monitoring scheme. Yep.
Hi. Here?
Oh, yeah. I was trying to find you.
Yeah. This is a little bit off topic, but we saw some very high temperatures, and I'm curious if you tested for any soil microbiota after heating it.
Yeah, the microbes like it up to about 35 C, 40 C. Once you go beyond that, they start to close down, go dormant. And when you get up to 100 degrees C in a sample, that's kind of the sterilization. So we've done in situ work at a lot of sites. Most of the sites are 100 degrees C, and what we see after that kind of level of treatment is very fast rebound. The world is full of microbes. There's biome, everywhere. And so the reintroduction of natural species, either through soil vapor or groundwater, back into the treatment zone after treatment, happens within months, within weeks. We start to see that. Also, these 100 degrees C breaks down a lot of organic material, so you have a lot of organic carbon, so the bugs are really happy to come back in. It's a banquet for them. These higher temperatures, it's going to take a while for the site to cool down, or for the soil to cool down, but again, you're going to have a lot of organic carbon. The bugs are basically gone at 350 C, but they'll be reintroduced, pretty quickly.
John, right here.
Yeah.
Great presentation, thank you. So a couple of questions. With regard to the XPS work that was done, I don't know enough about it, but are you, number one, able to differentiate between the different metal halides that are formed, and can it quantify those? And then number two would be, because there are some insoluble salts that are formed
Yep.
with fluorine, so does that become a mechanism to, like calcium fluoride, to intentionally put some additional calcium into the soil so that it facilitates that mineralization process under the elevated temperatures?
Yeah, I would say yes in general to your last question. I can't talk a lot about it because we have a patent pending on that. But in relation to the first one, yes. So we had a limited soil volume, 200 grams that we were treating. And if we had a larger sample, we could do more, we could identify species, fluoride species better. That's really what we want to do the next time around with one of these larger, either a pile or a larger quantity, the box, kind of concept. But yes, the XPS, we could get better information, more insight as to what metal fluorides are being formed if we had more volume. And we could do a better job of quantification. One of the things with XPS, you've got to remember it's a surface analysis, right? So if you're getting any kind of diffusion into the mineral matrix or into the soil matrix, you may not pick that up. So that's one of the limitations of XPS. We're really trying to use that as a way of identifying what what forms of metal fluorides are present there.
John. Hello.
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk, John. Could you tell us a little bit more about your field implementation of this 120,000 cubic yard dioxane pile? For example, if you have any information about the resulting cost per cubic yard, maybe the power requirements, are you able to cycle the different points, or you have to power them all at once? Anything?
Well, we do have some information on that, and I can give you my card, or we can change cards, and I can send you some case studies and descriptions. That was a project that was funded by the U.S. basically, and so there are final reports for that you can really dive into. But in general, we heated the whole pile up as so 60,000 cubic yards. We didn't do it in phases. There was sufficient power at this facility. It was, in Da Nang, Vietnam, so there was plenty of power to do that. In terms of costs, it's roughly $450 a cubic yard. In terms of power usage, you're looking at something similar, 400 to 450 kilowatt hours per cubic yard to do that. I think those were your questions. But I can give you some case studies to get you some more information on it, if you'd like. Yep.
Yeah, I just had a quick question regarding, like, I guess the practicality of using this in situ. I know you all have a lot of experience, with like chlorinators and whatnot, and using that kind of 100°C range, which, presents obstacles, but is more manageable. But
right.
If you're getting to that 350, 500°C, I mean, it seems like you'd have to have very little infrastructure nearby and just very specific conditions. So I was wondering about that, and then also, if you do it in situ, how controlled is the heat? How far does it heat lithology beyond the treatment zone?
Yeah, good questions. A couple things. One is we've done a number of PCB and PAH sites and dioxin sites in situ. We had a project in California, a former wood treater that had a lot of creosote, over 1 million pounds of creosote, but it was also mixed with pentachlorophenol, which had a byproduct, dioxin byproduct present. And so we treated that to below residential cleanup standards in situ down to depths of 110 feet. We were able to do that because the water level was at 240 feet. So the main limiting issue for in situ treatment of PFAS or these recalcitrant compounds in situ is water influx. So if you're close to the water table or below the water table, I wouldn't do it. I mean, you could envision some sort of engineering control of the sheet piles and stuff and dewatering, but you just couldn't reliably control water any appreciable distance or depth below the water table because of hydrostatic pressures and stuff and flux. So then it's an excavation, but it can be done in situ. We've done those projects, and there's also one of our competitors, TRS, is working with has an ESTCP project at Beale Air Force Base. That's I don't know if Lauren Seuss is in the audience, but she's here. Hey, Lauren, raise your hand. She, her company is got a in situ PFAS treatment project, and I think she was sharing with me that they're underway. I think she said they're already at 250°C. So this will take maybe a few more weeks to get up to their target temperature, and then they'll do their sampling. In terms of infrastructure, yeah, you're going to want to make sure you don't have any infrastructure or close it or abandon it that would be heat sensitive. I forgot the other part of your question, I think.
Yeah, just the effects on the surrounding
Oh,
lithology.
yeah. So how far out does it go? So the temperature gradient drops off quickly outside because it's the superposition of the heat fronts from the heaters in that grid here. On the outside, it's just heat losses to the world, right? To the soil, to the atmosphere. So you don't really see temperatures much above ambient 20 feet away from the outside, even at these high temperatures. It's a really hot zone with sharp gradients around the outside.
Another hand up over here. Okay, hang on.
Okay, now I need a beer.
A great presentation. I've got a question on your fluorinator. So, and I'm sure you looked at it, but you had your sand source and you possibly created fluorine metals. What other type of metals did you create in the first cell? And were you able to track them going into the fluorinator? And if they did get in there, I don't know how you would do it. Well, I guess if you did 4 of these, what kind of reduction in efficiency would you see? I don't know if you have enough information to calculate that kind of stuff.
Well, Yeah, there's a lot of stuff to do, right? So again, one of the reasons we use sand is we knew what the mineral composition of the sand was. It was you know, lab grade sand with a data sheet, so we knew what the mineralogy was. So we really didn't have a lot of minerals other than silicon dioxide in that sand to start with, although we did pick up some fluorine present there when we looked at the XPS, although it was a small muted signal. We don't really know what that is, right? And the defluorinator media was a mixture of, again, lab grade material with the sand, so we kind of had spec sheets on all of that. So again, this is pretty simple. I think there's complex, the degradation mechanisms at temperature are complex in natural soil because you have a whole range of mineralogy. What we were trying to do here was quantify what's happening in a simple system and then be able to scale that up to a full-scale system. And I guess hopefully in the next year or two when we get opportunity to do this again or a couple times and we have more soil and we can run some additional analyses, maybe I can come back and give you some insight as to what more specifically is happening there.
Fair enough, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, another instrument, I just want to comment the mystery about, you know, fluoride mass balance. You said the XPS can only detect the superficial, usually about, you know, 100 nanometer layer. Another instrument called XRD, X-ray diffraction,
yep,
which can tell the mineralogy of the material in the bulk, but that typically requires high concentration.
Right.
We need fluoride, probably high ppm or 1% level. So I'm not sure that instrument will help to, you know, provide more information.
Those good comments, and you know, Lynn Katz from the University of Texas and her group are, you know, we relied on them for their recommendations. We looked at a whole range of things, but just as you said, that's why we went with XPS. That's why we'd like to use more volume, higher concentrations, and be able to potentially, you know, with higher mass, be able to get more quantification of that. Yeah.
I mean, it's not uncommon for HF to react with silicon dioxide.
No, it's not.
Glassware, you know, our lab digesting that is using HF.
PFAS, it's complicated.
Yeah.
It's everywhere and it's complicated.
Particularly with, you know, high temperature.
Especially, yeah.
All right. Thanks. So just to close out real quick, just on this panel, you know, we're all sitting here for 3 days. It becomes very apparent that PFAS is daunting. A colleague of mine this morning was like, it's equally depressing. But like people like Jorge said yesterday, it's an issue that's not going away. Like Jenny proved to us today, you sample for it, you're gonna find it. What I think about it is it's opportunity for all of us scientists here in the room. I'm very grateful for you all for educating us today, John and Hugo, on innovative technologies to help us bring solutions that are both cost effective and that will work to help all of our clients. So thanks to all of you for being here, and I really appreciate the panel.
Thank you, Ellen, and panelists. Real quick announcement before we go into break. So we'll be back in the exhibit hall. I saved the last panel as for those of you that have attended the forum the last 2 years, you know that the attorney panel is fun to watch. That's one of the most intriguing panels to watch because you get the diverse competition between the panelists, right? So I saved that on purpose to keep everybody here. And so go to break, interact with the exhibitors, and then come on back in the room, and then we'll wrap this up. Thank you.